This programme and the second one on philosophy of science are designed to illustrate the arguments of the philosophy of science units by means of some examples drawn from the history of science. In particular, I want to illustrate the distinction between what Thomas Kuhn calls pre-paradigm and post-paradigm research, between the early kind of research into a subject which consists of little more than groping around in the dark, and the totally different kind of research which takes place against the background of a well-established theory or paradigm. This programme will deal with the problems of trying to establish a theory in the first place. The later one will show the kind of thing which happens once theories are established. We're going to start in the Great General Hospital in Vienna in 1848. This was the largest teaching hospital in Europe, to which students came from all over the world to learn all that was latest in medicine. Research flourished under such pioneers as Professor Rokitansky, who tried to understand the processes of disease by careful and methodical dissection. But for all such advances, medical techniques had hardly changed since medieval times. Surgery was horrifying and nearly always fatal, and no one had the faintest idea how to cure or control disease. And in the maternity wards of this great and modern hospital lay one of the worst hazards a pregnant woman could face, far worse than anything she would encounter in a home delivery.
Among the women here, the dread was not of birth itself, but of childbed fever, or puerperal fever, that followed it. Its progress was always the same. A woman would have successfully given birth, would even be nursing her child, when inflammation would spread over the whole abdomen. To reduce this, leeches would be applied. A little later, a high fever would develop, and with the mother often still protesting her good health, the bowls and red towels would be brought out for bloodletting. Finally, there was the last resort, to the leather belts for restraining the delirious. But one young doctor, Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian, was appalled by what he saw.
It's the story of Semmelweis's investigation which we're to follow in this programme. There were, of course, theories about the cause of the disease.
Puerperal or childbed fever is dependent on two factors. Externally, the miasma which hangs in the air overlying in hospitals like ours, or internally, the failure of the uterus to give a proper lochial or milky discharge, always very low in puerperal fever cases, or more likely an accumulation of milk in the body instead of being discharged from the breast or the uterus, thus leading to milk peritonitis. Any questions?
Now this is, in a way, a genuine theory. It's quite different from, say, a theory attributing the disease to food or the wrath of the gods or the stars. And actually it looked quite reasonable, given the facts. The disease occurred mainly in hospitals, and so might well be caused by an infecting miasma exuded by the sick inmates. And since it was women in childbirth who caught it, you would expect gynecological factors to be relevant. But still, it's a classic case of what Kuhn calls a pre-paradigm theory. Although it provides some kind of explanation of what's going on, it provides no clue whatever about how to make matters better. And it doesn't even suggest any research which would bring about improvement. And quite apart from this shortcoming, Semmelweis thought it couldn't possibly be right.
Any questions?
Yes, Herr Professor.
That doesn't explain this patient, sir.
I beg your pardon, Doctor.
This woman, sir. She was not pregnant.
And she has the fever?
Started last night.
Is not this the patient with the tumour?
Which I removed from the neck of the womb yesterday without difficulty.
Puerperal fever?
We had a similar case when I was a student. She died in a few days. She was not pregnant either.
So how could pregnancy or childbirth be responsible? And anyway, even if people like Professor Klein could be excused for not noticing these odd exceptions, there was another fact, well known to everyone, which seemed to rule out the prevailing theory completely.
No,
There were two divisions to the lying-in hospital. The first run by Semmelweis and his chief, Professor Klein. The second by midwives only.
Dr. Semmelweis?
Yes, Herr Director. Do we have a bed?
In the midwives division, there was nothing like so much puerperal fever as was found in Professor Klein's. In 1 year, 5 times as many women died from it in Klein's division as in the other. Semmelweis knew this well. So did the women who came here to have their babies.
How could a miasma settling over the whole hospital have such a strongly differentiated effect? Prevailing theory would not do, even as a hint about how to start research. Semmelweis simply had to start from scratch. And to understand his position, we must think ourselves entirely out of all we know about modern medicine and think of the situation as it must have seemed to him. Where could one possibly begin? By putting forward a theory and testing it? That's fine if you have a theory, but theories don't just appear out of the empty air, and Semmelweis had none.
It was in Rokitansky's analytical approach that Semmelweis saw some hope of understanding the disease. And so at 5 o'clock every morning, he'd come to the morgue to dissect the bodies of his former patients. At this time, Semmelweis, the son of a Budapest shopkeeper, was 28 years old. In spite of the suspicion with which Hungarians were regarded in Vienna, he had obtained the post of first assistant in the lying-in hospital. So far, his dissections had revealed a great deal about the processes of puerperal fever, but had brought him no nearer to discovering its cause.
And it was the cause he wanted to find.
It's not the only disease we can't explain.
But why so much stronger in my division than in the other? 15% last month against only 4% in the midwives' clinic.
And there's no difference between the two divisions?
No. Well, except that we have students.
Perhaps the women are more gentle.
How do you mean?
More gentler than the students when they examine. Perhaps the midwives...
Oh, no, Ferdinand. If the passage of a baby causes no injury, it's hardly likely that inserting a finger into the vaginal tract, however clumsy, could cause death.
But the students do examine more often, don't they?
Oh, no more than student midwives. It's clearly something to do with the first division. The death rate has been 4 times higher with us for the last 6 years.
How do you know that?
I've been collecting the figures.
No?
Scotus example.
It was clear to Semmelweis that he must inquire into the totally inexplicable difference between the two wards. He set out to investigate every single difference he could think of. Unlikely as it seemed, he even wondered if the disease might have anything to do with the fact that in his division the priest had to pass through the wards to reach the dying, while in the midwives he did not.
So the women don't see it, or have that bell to put the fear of death into their hearts before they even have their babies.
And do you think that's why they don't get the fever so much?
I very much doubt it. But from now on, I want everything conducted in our division exactly as it is with the midwives. The priest has agreed to take a roundabout route to reach the furthest of our wards round there, unattended, so there will be no bell. And henceforth, I want all of our women delivered in the lateral, not the dorsal position.
On this side? Why?
Because that is invariably how it is done in the midwives' division.
However, the differences between the two divisions were not the only things to be investigated. He had also to inquire into the variations in the occurrence of fever in his own division, to see whether he could find any significant correlation with other factors there. And he's just noticed a woman he found the previous night in a cab in labour, leaving her arrival in hospital as late as possible.
I had thought our greater mortality was due to something endemic to the first division itself. But if so, women who started their babies in the streets but were later delivered in our wards, whether they liked it or not, would also get puerperal fever. They hardly ever did.
Don't you touch me! Look, I didn't lie squashed up in a cab last night to have a whole lot of doctors going over me now. I shouldn't be in this ward anyway. Why, it was gone midnight when I got here. Why aren't I in with the midwives? Monday, isn't it?
They were full up.
Yeah. It's only in here they're empty beds. And they've carried the corpses away.
You don't need to worry about it. You won't become one.
So using these two techniques, comparison of the two divisions and observation of variations within his own, He persevered in spite of having no theory to guide him.
So if the cause is something to do with the first division, it must be something that happens before delivery.
Must be.
I'm having the windows kept closed for the next few weeks.
Why?
In the midwives division, the windows open onto a passage. It's only in our division they open directly onto the outside air. So if there is anything in this peculiarly active miasma that Klein believes in...
Soup again? I can't go another day with only soup.
That's all they get on the second day in the other division. And Dr. Semmelweis insists the diet's to be the same.
Well, what do I have tomorrow?
Soup. With bread and jam. Cheer up. On the seventh day it's roast veal.
She was delivered on her back, against my firm instructions.
I may say so, Dr. Semmelweis. None of your instructions have made any difference to the fever cases yet.
That's because they're not being obeyed.
Is there anything else, Doctor?
Yes. On every woman's bed, I want to see not only her ward number, but also the number of the bed she occupied in the delivery room. And if fever develops, I want the time it started as well.
Yes, Doctor.
You see, I'm beginning to notice that the fevers develop in exactly the same order as the women are examined in labour.
I've never doubted it's the students' fault myself. Some of these foreign ones we have.
Well, if it is, then we must prove it. We can only do that by eliminating all the other factors first.
Puerperal fever has been with us for as long as I can remember.
Oh, yes, Herr Director, but with respect, it was never like this in Professor Bohr's time.
Indeed.
I have the figures here. When Bohr was Professor of Obstetrics, it was only 1% of our women who ever died of puerperal fever.
Are you suggesting that this disease in some way emanates from me?
I'm only trying to connect the facts.
Almost as extraordinary as suggesting the priest has something to do with it.
The priest has nothing to do with it. Since I've stopped him going through our ward with his bell, there has been no reduction in the fever rate at all.
And since the midwives have been told to have the patients deliver on their sides,
no reduction either.
you admit it.
So we are gradually eliminating the factors that could be responsible until in the end I have no doubt we shall isolate the one that is.
Perhaps it's not altogether surprising that by this time Semmelweis was ruffling the feathers of a good many people who felt threatened by his methods. Very soon, Professor Klein found an excuse to dismiss him from his post and reinstate his predecessor, Dr. Bright. Semmelweis was reinstated again before long, but as it happened, even his dismissal provided him with a surprising piece of information. While he was away, the incidence of fever in the division dropped slightly. This was as astonishing as another fact which had been noticed. Professor Klein hated foreigners, and for a time had banned foreign students from the wards, and the incidence of fever had dropped then, too, apparently justifying the suspicions of both Klein and the senior midwife. So what was Semmelweis to make of this amazing mass of matter he'd collected? He had eliminated from his inquiry the priest, the miasma, diet and delivery position. But he also had a most extraordinary collection of information about what did seem to be causally relevant and which seemed to make no sense at all. The disease affected women, usually but not always pregnant. Its incidence was far higher in hospitals than in home deliveries, and much higher in the doctor's division of the hospital than the midwife's division. Then within the doctor's division, the incidence was far higher now under Professor Klein than it had been under Professor Bohr. Women with long labour were particularly susceptible, while women who reached hospital late in labour seemed relatively immune. The fever rate went down when Semmelweis was temporarily absent from the wards, and again when the foreign students were absent. And the women seemed to develop it in the order in which they were examined in labour. Think about how all this must have seemed from his point of view. Since women with long labour were particularly susceptible, it seemed as though the difficulties with birth must have something to do with the trouble. But then, how was it possible to account for the non-pregnant ones who caught the disease? Since women who arrived too late in labour to be examined were rarely affected, and since the women who caught the fever tended to do so in the order in which they had originally been examined, there was some evidence that the trouble lay in the examination. But then, why was there less fever in the midwives' division, where women were examined just as often? Suppose you tried to say that it had something to do with examination of women by men. Then you had the problem of why women who gave birth at home, attended by doctors, usually had no trouble. And in addition to these difficulties, there was the puzzling question of why Semmelweis himself and the foreign students should seem to be responsible. And the still more amazing fact that everything got much worse when Professor Klein succeeded Professor Bohr. Could you, without the advantage of hindsight, have thought of any theory to explain all this? There's no doubt about the potential value of all this material, but it doesn't on its own provide the answer. Inductive methods may provide the only way forward when there's no theory to direct research, but the results of inductive research cannot point inexorably to a promising theory. All they can do is provide the opportunity for inspiration, and the material which any future theory must take into account. So Semmelweis, in spite of all his work, still had to wait for inspiration, and it came by chance when he returned to take up his post as assistant again.
On my return, I was shocked to hear that Professor Kolechka had died, the man I held in the highest esteem.
How? Scalpel wound while dissecting. Ask Rokitansky, he did the autopsy.
Little more than a pinprick. They didn't even notice it.
I'm surprised Kolechka could be so clumsy.
It wasn't his scalpel. It was a student who was working in the same corpse. Be careful. Could happen to you.
To any of us?
It takes only the tiniest puncture for some minute particle of putrid organic matter from the cadaver to enter the bloodstream and... swollen finger, pain in the arm, fever. Yeah, read my protocol.
Pain, yes?
Yes, and pleuritis. Peritonitis. Abscess in the left eye. Gout.
Phlebitis. Meningitis.
Classic case of cadaveric infection.
And exactly the same pathological findings as in puerperal fever.
Yes, because that's a disorder of the blood as well.
But no one uses a scalpel in the lying-in hospital. They're not surgical cases.
That's a superficial point. The nature of the wound doesn't matter. But why cadaveric material should upset the balance of the blood? Now, Breck. Cut to expose the infected area.
Rokitansky, notice, is fully aware of the similarity of the symptoms of cadaveric poisoning and puerperal fever, but he hasn't noticed the significance, perhaps because he's concentrating on other questions. It's not enough just to have the relevant information. But Semmelweis sees the significance immediately.
It rushed into my mind with irresistible clarity that if the disease from which Kolechka died was the same as that which proved fatal to so many women after childbirth, then the cause could be identical. Did the women I see dying have cadaveric material carried into their circulation too?
It's very putrid, sir. That's not unusual, Breck. Carry on.
To that question I could only answer yes.
Every morning, ironically in the best tradition of the Vienna school, the students attended Professor Klein in the labour ward, examining women in childbirth. And they'd come there direct from the dissecting room.
Furthermore, the theory accounts for nearly everything Semmelweis needs to explain.
But they wash their hands.
Obviously not well enough. If a particle of cadaveric matter so small it could enter a pinprick in poor Kolechka and kill him, well, think what could happen in the wound left by the separation of the placenta alone. No wonder they have less puerperal fever in the midwives' division. They don't dissect in the dead house. And it explains why women with prolonged labour, who may be examined by students 2 or 3 times, invariably get the disease, while those with short labour generally don't. And also why they go down in rows. In the same order they were examined in the labour ward.
But it doesn't explain why women who are not even pregnant can get it. Students don't examine them in labour.
But they still examine them. And even if they don't, I do. Which is probably why the fever rate decreased when Dr. Bright temporarily deprived me of my post.
I understood it also decreased when foreign students were barred from the ward.
Well, of course, because they tended to be more conscientious than the others and examined more often.
Dr. Bright examined women, too.
Dr. Bright was not so anxious to discover the cause of this disease that he got up early every morning to dissect. His patients lived because he never went near the dead house. I had occupied myself with the cadaver to an extent reached by few obstetricians. God alone knows the number of women I assigned prematurely to their graves.
Everything was falling into place. Even the mystery of why things were so much better in Professor Bohr's time could be explained. He had not dissected. He had taught on what was called the phantom, a wooden model of a pregnant woman, with a cupboard for a womb and a doll for a fetus. Not quite everything fitted. The midwives didn't dissect at all, and some of their patients caught the fever. But still there was more than enough to go on and to justify a test of his theory.
Students and doctors, at least he includes himself, all students and doctors who enter the wards to make an examination must wash their hands thoroughly in the solution of chloride of lime, which is placed in convenient basins near the entrance to the wards.
And do it thoroughly, till there is no smell of the dissecting room on your hands at all.
There's a pretty foul smell from this, sir.
Not one that kills.
In view of the controversy between confirmation and falsification theorists, consider exactly what the outcome of this test would show. Suppose the disease went on as before. Would that show that Semmelweis's theory was wrong? Not at all. He knew nothing whatever about these supposed cadaverous particles, and they might not have been in the least susceptible to chloride of lime. But on the other hand, if the disease did subside significantly, it would show that he was right about both parts of his theory, that infecting matter was indeed carried on the hands, and that this matter could be made harmless by chloride of lime. And the disease did subside.
Within a month, the mortality rate fell from 12% to 3%. By July and August, it was down to under 2%.
So the theory was confirmed. His hypothesis was shown to be right, or at least close to right. Infecting matter was certainly carried on the hands from the dissecting room. So then, to review. How effective can research be in the absence of any guiding theory? It's hard to see how Semmelweis could have been more thorough in his analyses and comparisons, but his methods couldn't guarantee success. The truth eventually came not directly from his own research, but from the accident of Kolletschka's death, Rokitansky's pathological findings, and an inspired guess. On the other hand, without the background of his systematic work, he probably wouldn't have seen the significance of the accident. Rokitansky had known the relevant facts for a long time, but hadn't made the important connection. Discovery in these early stages of science is bound to be largely a matter of accident and inspiration. But as Pasteur once said, chance only favours the mind that is prepared.